I go around in circles on this all the time, because I do feel like since the pandemic, we've clearly gotten away from people-to-people contact, right? Like just you and I talking and having this conversation, which is why I think I was so excited that you were doing this, because it brings people into a conversation that they might not otherwise have. And it's hard to have this kind of conversation on social media where somebody wants to be right and somebody wants to make sure that you feel like you're wrong, right? That's not what this is about. This is actually about bringing lots of ideas to the table, making sure that all solutions and ideas are being heard, and then hashing it out. And that takes conversation, and that takes person-to-person interaction.
Our perception of houselessness it's a broad spectrum issue. But there are, of course, many other folks from all kinds of circumstances that end up without a place to live. Maybe one too many medical bills, maybe veterans who can't find housing, domestic violence situations that come about, all of that. I mean, it's all represented here in Salem.
At times it does feel like, even for us, it can feel like nothing's happening. What you see every day tangibly helps shape that expectation. If you're seeing the same person that never moves or the same group that never moves, we often get lost thinking nobody's doing anything. And in fact, there are several things in motion. There are several conversations being had. There are people being helped every day, but it's going to take a little bit of time to start to make that tangible.
The truth is, when people are interviewed who are experiencing homelessness, 8 out of 10 people are saying, I went to school here, I grew up here, this is my community. I don't go through a week without hearing people just need to get a job. The reality is, over 40% of the people we have in our shelters have a job, but they're underemployed and their pay is too low to do first and last and to make their rent payments. So we need work to equal you have enough money for housing. That's our first challenge. And then figure out how to make housing affordable to those folks willing to work.
I work with a client who provides recovery services to individuals suffering from addiction. And even that use was so heavily regulated and required tens of thousands of dollars for this user to be able to utilize existing structures. Why is that happening in Salem? We desperately need these services, and we regulate them to death, to the point where people give up.
I think there's this idea that, we're America, you pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you take care of business. But in reality, people need help doing that. And they need help navigating systems, and they need help knowing what kind of work is out there that they could potentially do.
Our good isn't good enough. Back in my day, we had one breadwinner in the house, and that was enough. Then it needed 2. And now if you look at cost of living, you need 3. That's a huge burden, not just on our seniors, but on every generation right now trying to make it.
The reality of homelessness in Salem is that it affects every age group, every demographic group that you can think of.
We don't all agree on how to address the challenge or even what the root of the challenge is, but when you can get people to the table all for the same reason, focusing on the same outcome, that's a good thing.
When you're struggling with homelessness and addiction, you seem to build walls. You build walls and just block out everybody, and there's people that love, and you gotta look past the homelessness and the addiction and the struggles.
I would answer that question in 2 different ways. One, if I was answering that question from some other part of the country, right? The West Coast homeless crisis for folks who live everywhere else in the United States, with the exception of the Northeast, is much larger and much graver and much more long-lasting than anything we've seen to date on this issue going back to the 1980s. It is the product of generations of really poor public policy choices. It's the product of some economic realities as well, and it's especially the product of extraordinary housing costs on the West Coast. If you're here locally, the homeless crisis has probably taken you a little bit by surprise. If you can remember back to the 1990s, you may see a few people that were homeless around town. You might have saw a shopping cart or two. But what you see today in terms of the gravity, just the extraordinary need levels out in the community, you would not have seen 30 years ago. If you were to go back to the early part of the 20th century, most people who were poor, who couldn't take care of themselves, lived in what we used to refer to as poor farms. And the poor farms were simply places that were primarily supported by counties where folks who were, struggling to compete in some ways, were sort of sent to live out their lives. And they may have been given a few chores and things of that nature, but they were given a place to live and room and board and things like that. That model faded away by the 20s and 30s because just was no longer economically viable. But when the Depression came along, it wiped those out. And so emerging to replace it was a state hospital system. And the state hospital systems really took off steam in the 1920s and became quite influential by the late 1940s. And by the time we get to like 1955 or so, there were about 475 people per 100,000 in these state hospital systems. And a lot of folks ended up there that weren't really in need of mental health services. They were just poor, they were disabled, their families could no longer care for them, they were elderly. It became a kind of catch basin in some ways for poverty problems. And those began to fade a little bit in the late 40s and early 50s, the American experience with World War II, and you may remember references to a lot of news coverage in the late 40s and early 50s of state hospital systems. There was a famous article in Look magazine in 1947 called Bedlam, and what they found was abuse and neglect and malnutrition and suffering. And there was a gathering movement by the 50s to get rid of these things. The quality of mental health drugs began to dramatically improve, and a lot of the conditions that folks had been sentenced to these state hospital systems could be treated successfully in the community. In 1963, we had the Community Mental Health Act, and that began to move resources away from the state hospitals and put it into community mental health. There was a massive disinvestment in social systems across the United States in the 1980s, and in the 1990s, we declared yet another war on poverty, but from the wrong end. So the very popular and successful aid to families with dependent children, that was a cash payment to poor folks, came to an end. It was replaced with TANF. So there was just a series of things that happened over the last 20 and 30 years of the 20th century that put us in a position to have this kind of housing crisis. And then the drug crisis emerged. If you go back to the 80s and 90s, you had a lot of marijuana, you had cocaine, the beginnings of the methamphetamine crisis, but nothing really compared to what we have today. By 2000, heroin, in fact, was kind of a dead drug. Then 9/11 happened, and then the wars overseas happened, and a lot of younger folks were prescribed prescription opioids by doctors who just really overprescribed those drugs and created an artificial heroin epidemic as a result of it. Once they began to get sued for that, they withdrew that, and then the folks who had become addicted began to look for synthetic sources. So when we get back to how somebody from Salem might see this issue in the 1990s, they didn't see what they see today. Saw a handful of individuals, a few tents, a couple of shopping carts here and there. They may have seen a few people who were mentally ill on the street corners, but nothing compared to what we've seen in Wallace Marine and Cascade Gateway and other parts of town in the last few years. So we are still reaching the peak of this crisis, triggered by all these events, and it would be getting better because of the massive investments that we have. But it's not getting better, and the reason that it's not getting better is because the affordable housing crisis in this state is so profound. People primary first entrance into homelessness, street homelessness, is an economic crisis, is losing the apartment that they had, going to live in their car, and then eventually losing their car, their insurance, their license, their tags, and those sorts of things, and then they're truly unsheltered. So most of the people that we see entering the system are largely there today because of economic reasons.
Yeah, the reality is there are so many reasons behind people being homeless on the streets of our city if we just focus specifically on Salem, because behind every person is a story. And to disregard the story is to disregard the individual completely.
So the reality is we have a lot of variations on what is houselessness. Of course, we have people who are chronically housing, which means that they've experienced being houseless over time for years on end. Maybe they've had temporary housing in there, but they end up houseless again. And I think that's what a lot of people consider, when they think about houselessness, or they consider individuals who they think have a substance use disorder or those types of things that they see out in our communities. But really, houselessness is individuals who have been displaced by the loss of a job or by an unexpected expense, and so they are unable to afford their rent, or just the rising cost of housing has really displaced them. So you see families that are houseless, you see, individuals that have just come across poor luck, but maybe they're sleeping in their car. And so houselessness looks like so many different things. You really can't, and I think that when you see more people that are experiencing situational homelessness, there may be, and they're needing to access more resources, we might see more of that street houselessness, where you're seeing the people who are literally outside. And I think those things grow together.
It costs taxpayers on average approximately $35,000 per year. And when they are in a supportive housing program, that cost is usually cut in half. In order to survive, people need food and shelter, and they can't start to work on long-term goals such as mental health stability or working on issues of addiction if they are worried about their lives or what they're going to eat that night. If homelessness is a complex issue, we need a complex approach to tackle that issue. And I really think that it's important to think of the individual holistically and work with other programs, both internally and externally, to really have a robust program.
Stabilized living isn't just giving somebody a house. There's a narrative that the housing first effort is really the way you should address homelessness. And I don't agree with that, because I don't believe that's an equitable model. I believe there are certain people that live paycheck to paycheck and they fall into unhousing circumstances. And because of that, they can enter back into housing probably just fine because they haven't been out of it for that long. But there's the equal part of the population that needs a lot more services.
The amount of time someone is unsheltered deeply impacts the amount of time they need to be restored to community. If we can catch a family as soon as they get evicted, or they just started living in their vehicle, the skills they have are the normal skills you would expect someone going to work and getting kids to school. But the longer that you're in survival mode, just looking for the next meal, how am I going to keep myself warm tonight? Those skills become the most important, and you begin to set your energy in that part of your brain, and it's a few weeks, and then it's a few months, and then it's a few years. So it takes a ton of trust to kind of like draw a person back into, it's not about survival anymore. We're helping make this a safe space. You can think about next week. You can think about what it's going to be like to be in an apartment and to do these other activities. The root cause of the homelessness you're seeing is trauma that has come from a deeply broken relationship or a number of relationships. So if I were looking for the greatest source of prevention, it would be cultivating healthy relationships with the people in our lives, especially people looking to you for care. Some of the folks most deeply traumatized in our community, if you see them, recognize probably the people who are supposed to love them and care for them deeply also are the ones who hurt them most deeply. And their only path back is going to be someone seeing them, someone loving them, building trust, that was deeply broken. You can see it in studies of even small children when they don't get that eye contact, that affirmation from a caring adult. Their brain activity actually slows down and shuts down. So many of the folks you're seeing in our community who you see as isolated, alone on the sidewalk, literally because of lack of human engagement, their brain is shutting down. And so part of what we're doing and saying yes to is just seeing them. And that seeing them and believing in them literally is going to re-energize the pathways in their brain to believe they're a person worthwhile and to increase their capacity.
First of all, I think what they see is people on the street who are struggling, and they don't understand everything that goes into trying to house someone who has experienced homelessness for a very long time. It takes a lot of work to reverse some of those habits that have been created from being unsheltered for so long. And so I don't think that they see that. I think what they see is that we're not doing it fast enough, and don't understand what it takes to actually support that community. There's also lack of affordable housing in the area. They've put up several new complexes, low-income housing complexes, but they're not enough to cover the need in Marion County currently.
I think a big misconception is that everything is a handout, when in fact a lot of what we're doing is a hand up. When you look at groups like Church at the Park or Community Action Agency, they talk a lot about what they're doing to heal the whole person. And that includes workforce development, that means treatment, that means helping connect that person with the job opportunities or the other opportunities that fell by the wayside when they were living on the streets. I think that living on the streets means that you are in survival mode. And a lot of folks are focusing on where they're going to sleep that night safely. And when you do that, it's really hard to think about anything else. So that's why shelter can be really effective. You get someone into a shelter bed even for a few days, and now all of a sudden, they don't have to worry about being assaulted in the middle of the night. They don't have to worry about turning their back on their handful of prized possessions for more than 20 minutes without someone robbing them or stealing from them. Imagine if you had to leave your tent every day and go to a job, and you come back and your tent is raided, and the cooking supplies, the sleeping bed you've been working with, your prescription medication is gone. That's the reality for some folks on the streets. So what we do, and when I mean we, I mean the royal we. I mean the City of Salem, the Salem Housing Authority, all the amazing nonprofits out there, we're all oaring in the same direction. We're all trying to create a customized case plan for everyone we come into contact with. One size does not fit all. So if you start listening to that person and they start opening up to you, that's when you can really find out where do they need to heal, how can they heal, and how can we help them get on that journey towards healing.
It's a combination sometimes of mental health, substance use. Many individuals on the streets have experienced trauma in their life. They might have physical disabilities or have experienced just hardships through their life. So we have to treat the whole person. We can't just find them housing and tell them to get a job. We have to treat their mental health symptoms to allow for that and work with them on substance use in order for them to be successful. But usually the first step for that is finding housing for them, because until those physiological and safety needs are met, they're not able to work on mental health or being sober.
Well, I think the housing crisis has to be looked at as a multi-pronged approach. There is no one answer to it. As we know, earlier this year, we're really working through the addiction crisis. There are several different contributing factors to what that housing crisis actually looks like. So It's treating the root problems. We can't just one size fits all. This is going to be an answer for one person. This is an answer. No, you've got to figure out the individual needs of what is keeping them out of housing? What is keeping them out of shelter? Is it an addiction crisis? Is that something that's treatable? Is it something where we've got job loss or something else to do with the economy? And so I think it's finding different ways to come into contact with people, but not in the sense that I'm just here. It's in the sense that I'm gonna build rapport. If I wanna get to influence and persuasion, and I want people to walk along with us, then I've got to build rapport with them that we're here to help, we're here to provide those services, we're here not to do a one-size-fits-all, but to figure out what your individual needs are, and then how does the sheriff's office fit into that component. So the sheriff's office oftentimes is coming into initial contact. And are we coming into initial contact because you've now moved into some place that you can't be? Is it through the criminal justice system? And in fact, you're committing theft. And again, are you committing theft because you're trying to put food on the table? Or are you committing theft because you're trying to foster your habit in the addiction crisis? The sheriff's office just ends up being that front line. We are the most visible coming into contact, but it's not always a law enforcement need. And I'll give you an example. Through the addiction crisis now, we've created a new team. So we're gonna have a lead outreach team. Lead is our law enforcement assisted diversion. But what I also wanted to do was put together a deputy, a lead navigator, and a qualified mental health associate to do outreach. And just like we're talking about, this group is gonna go out and build rapport. We certainly have tools now for accountability if we want to help foster that change and someone's not ready to change, but they are doing something, they are in possession, the huge mental health crisis. How do we get those folks into treatment? So that's really the role of the sheriff's office. I don't like being the housing police, so to speak, and it's more of a community issue than just the sheriff's office. It is all of our resources, but we can be that frontline facilitator that says, hey, here's where we want to get you into connection with, and then intentionally not just leaving them there, but how do we foster that connection?
Measure 110 came along, in my opinion, the worst possible thing that could have happened anywhere, let alone in Oregon. But it did. I think that the voters didn't realize the impact. I don't think anybody did. Measure 110 legalized drugs that changed the minds of people. And knowing that it's legal brought more people to be able to do what they wanted to do without accountability. And created, in my opinion, a population of folks that nobody knew how to deal with.
So I think what we really saw was, first off, Oregon has not had enough behavioral health and addiction providers and mental health therapists for a long time. And when Measure 110 happened, I think we expected that a lot of folks who may have previously been incarcerated for low levels of possession of substance uses would have been put into treatment. Well, that treatment piece was still not available, right? In fact, I think it was exacerbated by the fact that there was probably additional usage, right? And people felt a little bit more comfortable being able to have, controlled substances on them. And so that exacerbated a mental health provider shortage that we already had in place. So that was a big component of it. I think you also saw a lot of different jurisdictions kind of shut down their stabilization centers and their peer respite centers, right? And we weren't making the investments necessarily in the right places. And so now that House Bill 4002 has come into place again. And now I think a lot of jurisdictions feel like there is a way to do deflection, but also really highlighted the need for those resources. So I'm excited to see some of the sobering centers that are coming back online. And what I'm hearing from law enforcement is that it really is about healthcare and getting people the health care resources that they need to improve their lives, right? It's not necessarily about, arrest and incarceration. It's like, how can we as a community overall work to make people's lives better?
Yeah, so the amount of people continues to increase on the streets for many reasons, right? And there are many helpful options in Salem, and there are other options that are harmful. And so I believe that some of the efforts currently within Salem are some of the most harmful options because there's no accountability and people are allowed to use deadly substances, not just on the cusp of Measure 110, but at these different locations. You know, many of the low barrier shelters, they allow the use of those deadly substances on site. And then, you know, seeing people transition from those low barrier shelters into supported government housing, and those things were never addressed, and the individual gets evicted, and this is happening all the time. If they got their housing based off of a voucher and they're evicted, they're ineligible for another voucher the rest of their life. Yeah, I would say what we need is more options and opportunities for people to enter healthy programs that are actually going to set them up for success, that are not going to set them up for failure, right? And there are both of those represented in our city. Yeah, something that, you know, there's some rules, there's some accountability. Like Soaring Heights is a perfect example. They're able to take people and see them go straight from street to a home and have that transition, and then see them transition from that to their own living situation, and they don't let people use deadly substances. They have rules.
I think there is a place for no barrier or low barrier shelter. It actually enables sometimes even law enforcement or peer navigators to go into our parks and for those who are ready to say, you know what, I want off the street right now, to be able to give them an entry point and potentially connect them with services. And so if they're ready for the next step, we're meeting people where they are. I will say though, I've talked to people who are in recovery or who have had their own addiction problems, and they've said it wasn't until somebody gave me an ultimatum and I was either on the street, you know, or I couldn't get into a place that did have barriers and did have requirements, and I had to be completely sober in order to get in. And so I think there's a place for both though, but I would love to meet people where they are. And again, it's figuring out what kind of investments do we make in each and how do we address people.
Yeah, I've been a person who has done outreach first for a whole decade in this community before offering shelter. And I could say with confidence that safe shelter is a pathway to sobriety. When people have a safe and supported place to be, they move from their survival brain into the front portion of their brain where they're thinking more clearly about who they want to be and how they can get there to these sobriety goals. So I am such a strong believer in bringing people into a safe space, and that will help them make the choices that people want them to make around sobriety. I see addiction in 90% of cases as a secondary cause, a numbing, something people are going to because of the pain and trauma in their lives. But that doesn't mean it's not an accelerant. Many times people think no barrier to entry means no rules or expectations to stay in the community, and the opposite is true. All of a sudden, they need to develop a plan that starts with their health. How are you gonna make more healthy choices? Who's gonna be on your team? How are we gonna get you a primary care provider or a counselor? Then we move to income. What are your possibilities for income? What are your skills? What have you tried before? What are we gonna try now? Then we go to what housing lists are you already on? How can we get you signed up for as many opportunities as possible? Maybe you just wanna find an apartment because you're coming to us with a job and you actually just need to save up first and last month's rent.
I can't even tell you that if they got a job, they could actually support themselves. And I think that that is a new reality that we haven't been really willing to face. I think people will say things like, why don't they go get a job? Or, if they just had a job, they could pay for housing, they could pay for this, they could pay for that. And there's a lot of assumptions that they're not working or on the corner because they just want to drink or they just want drugs. And I don't think that's true at all. I think that The cost of housing is very expensive, whether you're trying to buy a house or whether you're trying to rent. I was looking around just a year ago, thinking about moving, and the rent prices were shocking to me. And I have a job. Our basic entry-level jobs are not necessarily living wages, so you can choose between rent or food. And I think that there's also, I think people just really struggle to feel worthy of going out and getting a job. And so I think we have so many labels that we put on people that we don't see the person. We just see what we think is the problem rather than truly sitting and listening and being able to help them address the individual pieces.
Yeah, I was on Court and Liberty Street, and I was disheveled, right? I'm sleeping on the streets. I'm saturated, like I'm not doing well. I'm physically a mess, and spiritually unhealthy. I'm saved, but I'm, serving me rather than what God has called me to be about. And I'll never forget it. And this man looks me right in the face, and he says, "Hey, lowlife, nobody loves you. Why don't you kill yourself?" And he didn't know me. He didn't know anything about me.
When someone doesn't have those basic needs, it not only affects them in an emotional way, it affects them in a behavioral way, a mental health way. This goes back to the larger scope of society, that there's pressures that we see from others, that maybe we have to try harder because maybe we're supposedly not trying hard enough, and we internalize that. So if we're falling short in some kind of way, we internalize that as people. And for that person that's experiencing the hardship, they're really gonna feel it. Even some of those people that come in, some of the people I've seen in counseling, they find it there's like a sense of shame in asking for help. Because it's like, to them, it's like admitting that they failed in some kind of way in life.
Dealing with those kind of feelings, you just felt hate, it just built up the hatred in you. Isolating yourself, it makes you suicidal. It makes you just don't care about anything, it just makes you angry and bitter. I think when you isolate yourself, you almost feel like you want to die, That's why it's very important to have community, to know that people are struggling just like you. Everybody goes through the same pain, just in different ways. Just because I was struggling with homelessness doesn't mean that you grew up without any struggles, because you didn't struggle with homelessness, right? But you went through some pain too, to get where you're at. So we all go through the same kind of emotional and spiritual pain, but in different ways. And that's how we can combine as a community, is when we realize that we all have pain. Just knowing that you have people that love you, it just gives you motivation to keep going every day. Gives you more of a purpose to live. It makes you stronger.
Well, I think first and foremost, we have a housing stock problem, not just here in Salem, across Oregon, and across the United States, honestly. I think we're about something like 140,000 units short right now in Oregon. But over 20 years, we're about 440,000 units short that we have to build right now. So that's a big part of the problem that we have. We also know that we have a lot of folks who are unsheltered and unhoused and have substance use, addiction, mental health problems. And so they find themselves, without shelter and probably without employment. So that's another piece of this puzzle, but it is, so it's a multiple of factors, but the big one really is housing stock.
Well, we know prices have skyrocketed across the board, right, for just daily living costs. And as all prices inflate, so too typically does housing costs, right? Salaries in a lot of ways have been slower to catch up to that. So, we see renters who are having to afford more expensive childcare costs, more expensive healthcare costs, more expensive groceries, and also more expensive rent across the board. But it's hard for those salaries to also keep pace with all those inflated costs. Affordable housing. Well, it means different things to different people, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it's supposed to just mean it's rent that people can afford, right? And that's what we're trying to build. But typically, there's funding in place to support affordable housing that has different limits for how much a person can earn in order to live there. So a lot of times, affordable housing is broadly defined as 60% of the area median income is kind of a limit. And then sometimes it can be less, and sometimes workforce housing is a little bit more. The state has a really hard job to do, right? They have to take those resources, which are never going to be enough to actually fill the demand, and they've got to think about a methodology to divide it up across the state. And typically they divide it up in metro, right? They look at sort of the Portland metro area as one region. They'll think about Frontier Oregon or Eastern Oregon. They'll think about rural Oregon. And right now, they also thinking about sort of the western part of the state, so up and down I-5 corridor. So that's where Salem is in this sort of, in a way, competing for resources with Eugene, Corvallis. And the state does their best, but it'll never satisfy all the need across the state. So I think Salem is seeing a lot of development in affordable housing, which is so important for several reasons. Well, one, there's a historic investment in affordable housing at the state level, right? So your governor's office, your legislature your housing agency has said, this is a priority across the state, and then they've put their money where that policy priority is. So hundreds of millions of dollars are coming through the state housing finance agency. So developers like us, we say, hey, here's a project we want to build. Can we get the funding for it from the state? And there's more money than ever to try to build that housing. And Salem as a market is a really interesting place for developers like us to try to work in. Salem has some incentives that make it slightly easier to get the buildings built. And affordable housing is hard. So when there's certain incentives or certain things that kind of make you born on first or second base, you kind of take it. And then you know Salem's a great market, it has access to subcontractors, there's good property management, so you think, okay, great. The city gets it, there's a tremendous need, there's some resources out there. All right, that makes it a pretty good option for trying to get it built. Well, it's a longer process than anybody wants, right? And I think that's the frustration what people see when they see, there's this huge need, or we see people in the streets and we think, well, there's money for this, it should just happen. And development takes time, even the fastest developments, right? So we have to find a site, we have to make sure it's appropriate for what we want to build, we have to tie it up for a period of time, and then while we're sitting on it and thinking, okay, this could be 100 units or 200 units or 50 units, we then have to go compete for resources, right? So we go tell the state, you should fund this project in Salem. Then we sit and wait, and by the time they tell us if we're funded, typically it's gonna be anywhere between 6 months and as many as 18 months to actually get it to where you can access your funding and build it. So you have to pull permits, you have to do the design, you have to work with the neighborhoods. Great, now you're breaking ground. You're looking at anywhere from 10 to 16 months of construction. Not done yet. Now you need 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months to get it leased up, and then another 3 months to convert to your permanent financing. So all in all, a development can take as long as 4 years to go from, hey, that's a good site, to it's a stable, healthy property that looks like any other apartment complex.
I think what we need is just a variety of housing types. So we have all of these regulations and requirements that people are unaware of. And not only that, it takes such a long time to get through the process that we have carrying costs and all of these other things. But this is so layered though, you guys. I mean, we have developers who bring housing into Salem all the time. So I have a client who brings a product that you probably recognize. They're called the Magnolia Homes. And they are persecuted for removing trees. So trees, although very important to a community and sustainability and environmentally friendly developments, is sometimes, are we choosing trees or are we choosing people? And it's almost like there's no way to win, because do we all want to live in a city that has no trees? No. We enjoy those streets that are tree lined. Those are the ones we love. But trees have a lifespan, and we have to recognize that sometimes they reach that lifespan, and replanting is the best thing to do. And sometimes redevelopment of a site is the time to do that. If you roll back development trends 10 years, say, so we're sitting in a subdivision that I worked on 10 years ago, And this was the product that we were bringing online. 7,500 square foot lots for, moderate to large size homes, single family residences, one house per lot, and that was it. And we've seen that trend change as housing has become more critical in Salem. So now that housing is more critical, you're seeing apartments coming online more and more and more. Part of that is because the cost to develop, especially in Salem, is so expensive that in order to make it work, the density needs to be higher. So that is one component. The other component is Salem is working hard to combat this and bring on more housing. So as harsh as I can be on the planning department, they're being proactive as well. We recently saw a code amendment that allows ADUs with townhomes. So previously, ADUs couldn't have townhomes, and I think this is such a cool idea. It's going to reduce barriers to entry because you can buy a townhome and you have rentable income almost immediately that the bank can consider when they're giving you a loan. So the more creative that we become, cottage type housing, small cluster communities, although not appealing to everybody, there are users who say, this is the type of housing that I want, this is what I can afford, I don't want something large, and so we need to appeal to more needs in that way.
Yeah, we are impacted by national stuff, state stuff, and here we are in the city. Our job, I believe, is to do as much as we can to stay out of the way and make it easy for folks to get things done. I'm not talking about, build whatever you want. I'm talking about, let's look at the rules, let's keep it common sense and reasonable, and we can get more done that way.
So out of all the demographics right now, one thing that shocked me the most is the percentage of senior citizens who are becoming homeless. It's one of the highest and fastest growing demographic groups of people experiencing homelessness in the nation. And it should terrify all of us because our older adults need help. They might have challenges with their abilities, in addition to challenges with their finances that every homelessness group experiences. Multi-generational housing is just one of the ways that we can connect seniors with other generations to provide those, what I would call the important points of connection, really.
That's where this piece for United Way of Mid-Willamette Valley and our cottages, it's a replicable program. These 400 square foot cottages can be built in many different places, and that's the tangible piece and the way that we can see this working. And I can tell you, if any of our cottage residents were sitting here, they would be in tears, and I see it and hear it every day. I was there today. They cannot believe that this is real. Number one, that this is real, that this has been provided to them. It's their own four walls. It's what they can handle. It's built so well. We have community spaces with gazebos and gas fireplaces, and they have instant friends that they can build community with. And it is truly magical. The community aspect of the cottages is truly something we didn't even dream at the beginning would be possible, but it has come along, this project, which makes it really special. We have built right in front of, practically right outside the front door of Sweegle Elementary, which has created something truly special. Our seniors get up in the morning and listen to the bells going off at the school and the morning announcements of the children that have learned, who have been given certain certificates and awards. They talk about life that's going on inside their schools. We have seniors that are wanting to volunteer within the schools, and they absolutely love listening to the children playing and on recess. And it's made something really special and to build that community. And then when we brought in a gazebo and put it in our main gathering space, these seniors are up later than you'd ever believe, just together enjoying life and having built-in friends.
Well, the city's role is really basic. As a governing body, our job is to provide public safety and infrastructure. Roads, water, sewer, everything, so you know when you turn the faucet on, water's going to come out and it's good for you. Okay, that's what we're supposed to do. You're supposed to be able to feel like if you have a problem and you call the police, they're going to come. If you have a problem and you need a fire department to show up, they're going to be there. That's our job. Our job is not mental health and addiction services. That's the county's job. County provides public health. So we need to work together with the county. That's the bottom line.
Well, there's a lot of different components of what we're focused on. The county doesn't do just one thing. In the human service space, when we think about housing, we're doing two things specifically: prevention and reaction. I've grown up in the community of Salem, the surrounding areas of Salem. I've been here for more than 25 years, and housing has always been a challenge. For me, running to be a commissioner was about identifying the challenges that we have in our service delivery system at the local level, which is county government, and figuring out how to make the doorways more obvious for folks who need service so they don't fall out of housing and into homelessness. Every single person in our community comes from some different culture, some background, religious, whatever, and they need to be seen for the individuals that they are, and then the system needs to wrap around them and help them stabilize in that environment and focus on what their goals are versus imposing someone else's goals on them.
What I'm hearing from elected officials across the political spectrum is that every single community is impacted by homelessness. I talk with other city councilors and mayors around the state, and it doesn't matter whether you're in Portland or Salem or Brookings or Canyonville or Silverton or Kaiser, homelessness is everywhere in this state. So it doesn't make sense to start blaming certain politics on homelessness. You can spend all day blaming, but what does that actually solve? Not a thing. Not a thing. So increasingly, I'm hearing people across the political aisle talk about the lack of affordable housing as a real crisis. And I'm thrilled to hear that, because when we all agree on what one of the fundamental problems is that impacts everybody, then we can finally work together and get things done.
The society that we live in today doesn't really foster an environment for real families and family values and understanding that people are complicated. I'll use my own experience as an example. My parents divorced when I was little. My mom had the same challenges when I was little that she had when I was older, and she was not easy to manage. She had a mom who had expectations of her that she couldn't fulfill, and so she wasn't cast out, but she wasn't accepted in. So more often than not, my mom wasn't a part of the family because she experienced whatever she was experiencing, and it just wasn't amenable to the lifestyle that her family or her mom fostered. Because of that, she sought life outside of her family unit. She fell into the wrong environment. She started doing drugs at one point because those people accepted her for who she was and the challenges that she brought. And of course, she brought her children along with her because she was a single mom. That problem just continued to grow over time, and she continued to seek family. She continued to seek being fulfilled by being seen and loved. I truly believe that every single human on this earth is after that. It really is that simple. But people are really complicated. And society now says that you don't have to, you fill in the blank, because of whatever reason, because you're free. And I disagree with that. I think as difficult as families are, you should try to find space to be a part of. And if you don't know, ask for help. I think we also, in our society, shy away from what we don't know. And we feel less than, or whatever negative feeling you want to attribute to not knowing or not knowing how. And because we can't be vulnerable enough to reach out and say, this is super hard, I don't know how to do this, I love this person, but I can't right now, can you? The people get lost, and they just get lost and lost and lost. And the further they get away from their family, the further they get into homelessness, and the harder it is to get them out of it, because they're just alone. And for the government, or for any system of care to try to fill the gap of being alone is near impossible. That's self-work that one person has to do on their own. And there are systems of care to support them through that, but it takes a long time. And I think we don't have a long time in our society. Time is right now, you know, with the way the internet is, with the expectation of society because of social media. People have no patience. And it makes it that much more difficult for somebody to be able to recover. And I don't care what system it is. It takes a long time for people to be healed and to be whole and to be stabilized. And that journey is so unique, person by person. It feels almost insurmountable. Like we're never gonna be able to push this rock up this really steep hill. But I'm a total optimist, and I'm also a doer. I'm not afraid of the challenge and or the capacity of need that we have right now. I just know that we have to be doing it together, and we have to be super honest about it. And that honesty requires accountability. The people that have fallen so far into their homelessness that they're just a consistent addict, or they've become so engulfed in their homelessness because of their addiction, they now have a serious mental health issue. The community has to decide what our community expectations are. What are we willing to live around? And be able to bring those folks who are just failing out constantly into an accountable system of care to return them back to what hopefully they want and what we want for them. Nothing is permanent. I'm not talking about institutionalizing people, but I am talking about holding them accountable long enough so that they can live a prosperous, healthy life amongst us.
People in those desperate situations will cling on to whatever they can to find self-worth, to find people who care about them and that they fit in with. And those communities have been created out on the streets. And it's really difficult to engage in a way to give them opportunity that, number one, they're gonna believe is actually true, because they don't. Number two, that the reality is that, can I do enough to get there again? And they've created family that's hard to let go of in those spaces. And oftentimes they have barriers that they have to crash through, and they can't, a lot of times can't do it on their own. So who are the people who are showing up to help support them and lift them up and crash through those barriers and say, you can trust me. We're gonna get there. We're not gonna put you on a housing list for 4 years. We're not gonna make promises that time's gonna run out on you, for our seniors especially. And where those solutions really, really pan out, and they're not left, and they're not given a home and just left alone. Here you go, here's the key, bye, good luck. But not only are you greeted, you are welcomed, here's the key, I'm not walking out on you. What you still are gonna need to make a vibrant, supported, quality life, we're gonna be here for that too.
So I went and I met with a gentleman who was at Sequoia Crossing, actually, and he had contact with a peer navigator who brought him into the shelter and put him on a path to recovery. And he has now reconnected with his, I think it was his daughter, and was it a sister? And so I actually think that that reconnection and that need for community is there. And sometimes, and what ends up happening, I think a lot of times, and again, this is just one person in his story, but I was crying when I went in and talked to him, and he was telling me about this, and he was like, I know what this feels like now. He's like, and I never want to lose it again. Because he had lost contact with his family members for so long. And to hear him say that, and I mean, I was hugging this guy. I had just met him, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, I'm so proud of you. I don't know you, but the fact that you reconnected and reestablished those relationships and that feeling of wanting to be connected with people, it was powerful and so moving.
Whose job is it to solve the issue of homelessness? Wow, that can go in so many different directions, but I think ultimately it's all of ours.
When we talk about whose job is it primarily to tackle, it's kind of like when we talk about public safety. Public safety is not law enforcement. Public safety is the community.
Whose responsibility is it to fix homelessness? Ooh, I love that one. Mm-hmm.
I think it's everyone's responsibility. I don't think you can point and say one person can fix this.
Man, it's all of our problem, right? I mean, that's the thing, is it's never gonna be one solution.
Whose job is it to solve the homeless crisis? It's all of our job.
I'd say put yourself in their shoes. What if it was you or your kid? Or maybe you have somebody that you love that is struggling with our community problems right now. Put yourself in their shoes, you know?
I would say, you know, as we think about whose problem is this and can I keep this problem as far away from me as possible, I would say most of us can look deeply at our own family tree and say, oh, has anyone in my family ever had a major health incident? Is anyone in my family struggling with mental illness? Has anyone in my family lost a job? And do I want that person to be kind of caught by the strength of community to have another chance and to, you know, not end up cold, isolated on the street? And I think most of us, when we think about our family, we would say, yeah, that's my problem. I want to be a part of that safety net. And so I would say every one of those people we see, they're part of somebody's family. And can we be a part of that supportive family?